The people had done it so many times that they only half listened to directions. Most of them were quiet, wetting their lips, not looking around. Then Mr. Summers raised one hand high and said, "Adams?" A man disengaged himself from the crowd and came forward. "Hi, Steve," Mr. Summers said, and Mr. Adams said, "Hi, Joe." They grinned at one another humorlessly and nervously. Then Mr. Adams reached into the black box and took out a folded paper. He held it firmly by one corner as he turned and went hastily back to his place in the crowd, where he stood a little apart from his family, not looking down at his hand. "Allen," Mr. Summers said. "Anderson, Bentham." "Seems like there's no time at all between lotteries anymore," Mrs. Delacroix said to Mrs. Graves in the back row. "Seems like we got through with the last one only last week." "Time sure goes fast," Mrs. Graves said. "Clark, Delacroix." "There goes my old man," Mrs. Delacroix said. She held her breath while her husband went forward. "Dunbar," Mr. Summers said, and Mrs. Dunbar went steadily to the box while one of the women said, "Go on, Janie," and another said, "There she goes." "Where next?" Mrs. Graves said. She watched while Mr. Graves came around from the side of the box, greeted Mr. Summers gravely, and slipped a paper from the box. By now, all through the crowd, there were men holding the small folded papers in their large hands, turning them over and over nervously. Mrs. Dunbar and her two sons stood together, Mrs. Dunbar holding the slip of paper. Now, I'm sure you can all imagine. Someone tells you not to do something, and you can do it, because they all have the piece of paper in their hands. They can look at it, but someone is telling them not to do it. Can you imagine the anxiety and the nervousness that goes on? We don't even know what's on these pieces of paper, but we can tell that it's important and that these people are anxious and just want to know what's on this piece of paper. They keep turning it over in their hands. They keep fidgeting with it, waiting to see what's on it. "Harvard, Hutchinson." "Get up there, Bill," Mrs. Hutchinson said, and the people near her laughed. "Jones." "They do say," Mr. Adams said to Old Man Warner, who stood next to him, "that over in the North Village they're talking of giving up the lottery." Old Man Warner snorted. "Pack of crazy fools," he said. "Listening to young folks, nothing's good enough for them. Next thing you know, they'll be wanting to go back to living in caves, nobody working anymore. Live that way for a while. Used to be saying about lottery in June, corn be heavy soon. First thing you know, we'd all be eating stewed chicken weed and acorns. There's always been a lottery," he added petulantly. "Bad enough to see young Joe Summers up there joking with everybody." So people are, it seems that this is not the only town that does the lottery. Many other towns do the lottery, but some are starting not to. And we get a little hint about why the lottery started with the phrase "lottery in June, corn be heavy soon." What that means is when they hold this lottery, it's a good prediction of their corn crop in the fall. So if they have this lottery, they're going to have a good corn crop. So that's why they started this. But some people don't want to do it anymore. But remember how important tradition is with this town. You know, they don't want to change a black box. But some people are thinking about it. This guy brought it up. Why would he bring it up if he wasn't thinking about it? "Some places have quit lotteries," Mrs. Adams said. "Nothing but trouble in that," Old Man Warner said stoutly. "Pack of young fools." Martin, and Bobby Martin watched his father go forward. Overdyke, Percy. "I wish they'd hurry," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. "I wish they'd hurry." "They're almost through," her son said. "You get ready to run, tell Dad," Mrs. Dunbar said. Because remember, Mr. Dunbar broke his leg, so he's not here. So when whatever happens if this lottery happens, he's got to go run and tell his dad. Mr. Summers called his own name and then stepped forward precisely and selected a slip from the box. Then he called, "Warner." "77th year I've been in the lottery," Old Man Warner said as he went through the crowd. "77th time." "Watson." The tall boy came awkwardly through the crowd. Someone said, "Don't be nervous, Jack." And Mr. Summers said, "Take your time, son." Zanini? After that, there was a long pause, a breathless pause, until Mr. Summers, holding his slip of paper in the air, said, "All right, fellows." For a moment, no one moved. Then all the slips of paper were opened. Suddenly, all the women began to speak at once, saying, "Who is it? Who's got it? Is it the Dunbars? Is it the Watsons?" Then the voices began to say, "It's Hutchinson's. It's Bill. Bill Hutchinson's got it." "Go tell your father," Mrs. Dunbar said to her older son. People began to look around to see the Hutchinsons. Bill was standing quiet, staring down at the paper in his hand. Suddenly, Tessie Hutchinson shouted to Mr. Summers, "You didn't give him time enough to take any paper he wanted. I saw you. It wasn't fair." "Be a good sport, Tessie," Mrs. Delacroix called, and Mrs. Graves said, "All of us took the same chance." "Shut up, Tessie," Bill Hutchinson said. "Well, everyone," Mr. Summers said, "that was done pretty fast, and now we've got to be hurrying a little bit more to get done in time." He consulted his next list. "Bill," he said, "you draw for the Hutchinsons family. You got any other households in the Hutchinsons?" "There's Don and Eva," Mrs. Hutchinson yelled. "Make them take their chance." "Daughters draw with their husbands' families, Tessie," Mr. Summers said gently. "You know that as well as anyone." "It wasn't fair," Tessie said. "Seems to me like this lottery is not a good thing if Tessie's not very happy that her family got chosen for this. Now, when we think of lottery, usually we think of like buying a lottery ticket or a scratch off or something, some sort of like gambling with money. Seems here that winning the lottery is not the same as winning the lottery in our world, and we have to keep that in mind because we still don't know exactly what's going to happen to this family at this point. It's not just one person anymore. They're asking about the whole family. Why are they doing that? "I guess not, Joe," Bill Hutchinson said regretfully. "My daughter draws with her husband's family. That's only fair. And I got no other family except the kids." "Then, as far as drawing for families is concerned, it's you," Mr. Summers said in explanation. "As far as the drawing for the household is concerned, that's you too, right?" "Right," Bill Hutchinson said. "How many kids, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked formally. "3," Bill Hutchinson said. "There's Bill Jr., Nancy, and little Dave, and Tessie and me." "All right then. Harry, you got their tickets back?" Mr. Graves nodded and held up the slips of paper. "Put them in the box then," Mr. Summers just directed. "Take Bill's and put it in." "I think we ought to start over," Mrs. Hutchinson said as quietly as she could. "I tell you, it wasn't fair. You didn't give him time enough to choose. Everybody saw that." Mr. Graves had selected 5 slips and put them in the box, and he dropped all the papers but those onto the ground, where the breeze caught them and lifted them off. "Listen, everybody," Mrs. Hutchinson was saying to the people around her. "Ready, Bill?" Mr. Summers asked. Bill Hutchinson, with one quick glance around at his wife and children, nodded. "Remember," Mr. Summers said, "take the slips and keep them folded until each person has taken one. Harry, you help little Dave." Mr. Graves took the hand of the little boy, who came willingly with him up to the box. "Take a paper out of the box, Davy," Mr. Summers said. Davy put his hand into the box and laughed. "Take just one paper," Mr. Summers said. "Harry, you hold it for him." Mr. Graves took the child's hand and removed the folded paper from the tight fist and held it while little Dave stood next to him and looked up at him wonderingly. "Nancy next," Mr. Summers said. Nancy was 12, and her school friends breathed heavily as she went forward, switching her skirt, and took a slip daintily from the box. "Bill Jr.," Mr. Summers said. And Billy, his face red and his feet overlarge, nearly knocked over the box as he got a paper out. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. She hesitated for a minute, looking around defiantly, and then set her lips and went up to the box. She snatched a paper out and held it behind her. Bill, Mr. Summers said. And Bill Hutchinson reached into the box and felt around, bringing his hand out at last with a slip of paper in it. The crowd was quiet. A girl whispered, "I hope it's not Nancy," and the sound of the whisper reached the edges of the crowd. "It's not the way it used to be," Old Man Warner said clearly. "People ain't the way they used to be." "All right," Mr. Summers said. "Open the papers. Harry, you open little Dave's." Mr. Graves opened the slip of paper, and there was a general sigh through the crowd as he held it up, and everyone could see that it was blank. Nancy and Bill Jr. opened theirs at the same time. Both beamed and laughed, turning around the crowd and holding their slips of paper above their heads. "Tessie," Mr. Summers said. There was a pause, and then Mr. Summers looked at Bill Hutchinson, and Bill unfolded his paper and showed it. It was blank. "It's Tessie," Mr. Summers said, and his voice was hushed. "Show us her paper, Bill." Bill Hutchinson went over to his wife and forced the slip of paper out of her hand. It had a black spot on it, the black spot Mr. Summers had made the night before with the heavy pencil and coal in the coal company office. Bill Hutchinson held it up, and there was a stir in the crowd. "All right, folks," Mr. Summers said, "let's finish quickly. Remember, we don't know what the lottery is yet. We know that it goes from everyone in the town choosing a slip to one family choosing a slip, and the person of that family wins the lottery. But again, it seems like winning is not a good thing, which is very strange. Although the villagers had forgotten the ritual and lost the original black box, they still remembered to use stones. The pile of stones the boys had made earlier was ready, and there were stones on the ground with the blowing scraps of paper that had come out of the box. Mrs. Delacroix selected a stone so large she had to pick it up with both hands and turned to Mrs. Dunbar. "Come on," she said, "hurry up." Mrs. Dunbar had small stones in both hands, and she said, gasping for breath, "I can't run it all. You'll have to go ahead. I'll catch up with you." The children had stones already, and someone gave little Davy Hutchinson a few pebbles. Tessie Hutchins was in the center of a cleared space now, and she held her hands out desperately as the villagers moved in on her. "It isn't fair," she said. A stone hit her on the side of the head. Old Man Warner was saying, come on, everyone." Steve Adams was in the front of the crowd of villagers, with Mrs. Graves behind him. "It isn't fair. It isn't right," Mrs. Hutchinson screamed, and then they were upon her. Morbid ending. If you don't understand what is happening at the end of the story, the person who won the lottery, which ended up being Tessie this time, stood in the center of a circle while the entire village threw stones at her in order to kill her. And we do know that the reason this happens is because of the crops. So this place, and places, because we found out there was more than one town that did this, believe that they need to make a sacrifice every year on June 27th in order to have good crops that year. Very interesting end to the story, I think. Definitely not what I was expecting. Good luck with the questions for this story, and don't forget to visit my office hours if you need any help.